Welcome to Life Expansion After 50. Today's episode is on creating and maintaining a habitual growth mindset. If you're here, it's likely because you understand the power of growth, not just in your business, but in yourself as a leader, a thinker, an innovator. Now, you're likely already familiar with the term growth mindset. It's become a bit of a buzzword, often understood as simply being open to learning or believing that you can improve and do more, and then going after it. But I'll tell you and show you that the true essence of a growth mindset goes far beyond that surface level understanding. Now, first, a little background. A growth mindset, as defined by Carol Dweck, is the belief that abilities and intelligence can be developed through dedication and hard work. It's about embracing challenges, persisting through obstacles, seeing effort as a path to mastery, learning from criticism, and finding inspiration in the success of others. On the flip side, a fixed mindset is the belief that our abilities are static. We either have them or we don't, and there's little that we can do to change that. Now, it's really interesting because most people have been involved in learning or teaching someone to ride a bicycle or both. Imagine a parent who took the training wheels off of the bicycle and the child tried to ride the bike and fell over, and they just said, you know what, I guess you don't have it. You're not going to be able to ride a bicycle. We would probably admonish that parent for doing so. But yet we do that with our lives. Now, on the other hand, you probably wouldn't take the bike out of the box, put it together, and put the kid on it, some people do, and have them ride down the street. We first get them to sit on the bike, pedal, steer, navigate, crash a few times in the learning process. Everything is a learning curve. And even when we go through school, one class builds on the other, one builds on the other. But an interesting thing happens. By the time we're up to around the time of 27, when the prefrontal cortex is formed, we're used to every year we just get better. Nothing has to change. We do a little bit of effort, a little here, and we get better. We get better through school, we get better at work, and then around 27, when we're expecting, I can remember being in my 20s looking at people at their 40s and thinking, my gosh, I'm going to be so far ahead. But something interesting happens around 27 once the prefrontal cortex is formed. And by the way, the brain has 100 billion neurons and 20 billion or so of those are in the prefrontal cortex. That's a good portion of our brain that's developed from age 19 to about 27. And then we start to level off. And I believe it's that leveling off that we start making mistakes and we're not getting better. And we lose faith that we're going to be able to do things. Because remember, before that, getting better required no effort. As a matter of fact, from 0 to 5, we didn't have to work for what we learned. It just 0 to 7, actually. It was just downloaded, right? And then through the teens, we just kept getting better. We were stronger, mentally stronger, physically stronger. In our 20s, we were able to apply things because now the prefrontal cortex is sort of organizing all that conditioning. And then at 27, we start to level off and we start to fear that, oh my gosh, this is it. I'll never get better. And we stop. When I say trying, what I mean is we stop going after it. We'll do things. We'll attempt to do things. But often it's pass or fail. If we don't get it on the first time, I guess we don't have that skill. That would be like taking the kid and putting the training wheels back on for the rest of their life just because they fell off the first time. See, some things that there are things that you can do to help shift to a growth mindset. And part of it is the words that we use. Now, last week I mentioned simply by adding the word yet when describing something you can't do can begin to prime to move you towards that growth mindset. Instead of saying, I don't know how to do it, I don't know how to do it yet. I haven't figured it out yet. No, sales haven't picked up yet. It keeps you in the game as opposed to closing in and getting that kind of red mist urgency thing. Other examples include reframing failures as feedback. It's just part of the learning process. Riding the bicycle, the kid may fall a little bit, but that's part of the learning process. There's muscle memory. And interestingly enough, you can relate muscle memory and riding the bicycle, but people don't think about it that the muscle memory is actually nervous system memory. And that nervous system memory is what's at play in what we say, what we think. We have habitual thoughts. We have habitual verbal patterns. All of that is the same thing that we see in muscle memory. So when you start thinking about it as nervous system memory, and you look at how we practice things on the physical side, we would never expect a football coach to add a player and just assume that that player is going to know all the plays. And no, they have to do drills. What are those drills for? It's to develop the conditioning so they do it without thinking. And that's what we want to do with our cognitive processing, is to be able to do it without thinking. So we want to avoid words like always, never, or judgmental words like should and must, especially when engaging in self-talk. Most of those are coming from the past. And every moment we have a new opportunity. I would also say watch them when we're using them with other people, because seldom is always and never accurate. I used to just say always and kind of, give them that look and make them think about it. Well, maybe, and sometimes, yes, always. Well, okay, so, and we'll talk about that today because they're obviously triggered. And that's not the time to go through that. We've got to back them up a little bit, right? But certainly with self-talk, but also, as I said, with speaking with others, rarely do they represent the entire story. Other thing we can do is separate from the outcome. The real value of a goal is who we become. Along those lines, while I fully subscribe to the idea of SMART goals, as a matter of fact, I was in a room, and I believe that this is where it started, but it was probably happening multiple times around the world. But this was in 1980. I was in a room with a couple of guys. We were distributors for Success Motivation Institute, and we were working through literally SMART, and we were struggling with aggressive, then do we make the R realistic, and should we make the A achievable? I remember struggling through that, and we kind of left it open that we were going to try different things. In 1980, Success Motivation Institute conference room, we were having that conversation. And I didn't really think about it much. I used it on my own goals, but then in 1995, it started showing up. So I don't know when it became mainstream. I don't know if it really started in that room or if it was a movement that was going on in the 80s. It's just interesting. I say that to say I 100% agree with the idea of SMART goals: specific, measurable, aggressive, realistic, and time-bound. We were using target dates, by the way, at that time. However, I would say that this podcast is about life expansion. By definition, expansion means we're going beyond where we've been. And if we're going beyond where we've been, that means we're in that upper area, right? Infinite possibilities. And in infinite possibilities, things go both ways. So what I was saying is that the SMART descriptions, when we're rising above the line into the infinite possibilities, it's a different world up there. And because if I were to tell you, I want you to visualize getting in your car, starting it, and driving to XYZ. You could visualize all of that, especially if you've been there before. You can visualize how that whole thing looks. But if I told you to visualize finding a parking space that's close to where you have to go, that visualization is different because you don't know where the parking space is. You kind of sense it. The people who do this, you sense it. You kind of like have a essence of a close parking space, but the details are not filled in. And that's what I talk about when we're above the line. So when we're in expansion, we're up here. And by being up, what I mean by that is in the possibilities. So you're not necessarily going to put time to it. When you put a time description, you can prime yourself into limited thinking because now there's only so much that you can do. Another related example, if you take somebody's goal and you say, let's 10x it, and they may have been struggling with a 1.5x on that goal, right? Or 1.3x, 1.7x. Think about sales. And they may have been struggling with that. But if you open it and say, you know what? Let's go after 10x. Seems impossible. But then what happens is it opens their thinking. They get out of the time bound, right? Because now you have fear. Everything is fair game. You can literally live into the possibilities. So I want to caution people on getting too defined with those quote unquote SMART goals when we're talking about above the line, self-actualization, pursuing purpose, because all of these things are going into the unknown. And how can you have a specific, measurable, time-bound goal that's into the unknown? As a matter of fact, how can you have one that's realistic? It won't be realistic because you've never seen it before. So that's another topic for future episodes. Checking yourself on language that argues for your weaknesses is another problem. Or maybe argues for the opposition, because once you start arguing for your weaknesses or arguing for the opposition, you're priming yourself into sort of a lost state or a losing state. I could go on, but today is not about the basics of a growth mindset. Again, most of you know about that. Carol Dweck's book, Growth Mindset, is excellent. I recommend reading it, even if you a summary. But the big missing in that book, in my opinion, is that, and it's not a knock on the book, it's that it leaves the door open for people to think that all I have to do is believe that I can have more and I'm going after it. I set goals and therefore I have a growth mindset. That is the farthest thing from the truth. Today is about a major shift that's required if you are to live into life expansion. Now, while many professionals will recognize these definitions, what's less discussed is the depth of influence mindset has in nearly all aspects of life and business. If mindset truly encompasses what is set in the mind, which is what the word suggests, and 95% of what we do is based on habit, then we need to expand our understanding. This is better described as set conditioning. Now, I'm not suggesting we change the word, but for the sake of today's conversation, if you think of it as the set conditioning rather than mindset, it'll make more sense. Why? Because mindset suggests that it's in the conscious mind, the cognitive part of our processing that's actually mental, whereas up to 95% of our cognitive processing is actually physiological. It's the neurons, it's the synapses, it's the habit patterns that we've been following, the stimulus response coming from the outside. So rather than think of it as mindset, I'm going to call it conditioning set to make today make sense. And it ties in with the last 3 episodes. It goes well beyond our conscious thinking, and it gets to our conditioning, which impacts virtually everything. Understanding why maintaining a growth mindset matters is critical. Business leaders often face volatility, chaos, and uncertainty. In fact, there's a term, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It's easy to fall back into a fixed mindset, and I'll tell you that VUCA is going to be increasing. Just look at AI. Look at what's going on with AI, and you look at the geopolitical events. VUCA is going to continue to increase, so we have to be in a position where we can accept those challenges and take them as they are. So it's more about not just adopting a growth mindset when everything is going well, but maintaining it and returning it to it quickly during tough times, especially when we get thrown off course. This isn't just a mental exercise. It's the strategic advantage that influences how we lead, how we adapt and innovate and respond to VUCA. Today, I'm talking about the pre-stimulus phase of stimulus response. If mindset shapes 95% of what we do, then changing our mindset must start with viewing the pre-stimulus phase as an expanded stimulus response. Again, living 95% is in essence an endless journey of stimulus response, with each response priming us for the next stimulus. This is why people will do the same thing over and over while wishing for a different result. It's not really the definition of insanity, it's the definition of habit, because the habit is so powerful it overrides the intention. It's not just about understanding growth mindset as a concept. It's about embedding it so deeply into our way of being that we naturally maintain it, even in moments of stress. By creating the right habits, when we do fall off course, we can return to that state in seconds, equipped to lead ourselves and others from a place of resilience and resourcefulness. Think of this in the context of making the shift from have, do, be to be, do, have. I talk about it quite often. It's the foundation of my 7 fitness areas roadmap. Today, we'll go deeper into how you can achieve this shift using deep practice and neuroplasticity, tools that will enable you to expand your potential and truly embody the be, do, have principle in your life and in your leadership. First, a quick review of where we've been in this series. This is number 4 in the series on the unseen power of words. And while we're not necessarily talking about words today, understand that words trigger us. And I talked about they're more than 7%. I mean, they can be 100% of the experience because they can trigger people into unresourceful states. So let's do a quick review. And this is the diagram I started with 3 weeks ago. I have out here beliefs and our condition. So for example, somebody walks in and you say, wow, you look kind of down today. That's what I'm calling a condition. It's beyond state, right? Because a person's condition can override their state. And people get triggered into a particular condition. They're just the way they feel, just their, being ill. Like it may be impossible to get to a positive state if they're dwelling on their illness or if they're dwelling on a certain emotion. State can impact condition can impact state, but I like to go upstream, and I would say condition is upstream of state, because if I have to get myself into an empowered state, it's easier to do that if I am in a high energy condition. And that's what I have here. So I have conditioning and then condition, belief, conditioning, and that leads to the condition. And then that leads to priming. And all of this is covered in the prior episodes. And then when we have priming, we have internal priming. That would come from self-talk, things we're doing, where we're going, habits of thought, getting up later than we should, scrolling social media. That's a big one, because you could see first of all, that alpha state of the brain, when the brain is when you first wake up. I mean, you could see something on social media that can just trigger you into another zip code. And then we have external priming. And these can be words, but they can also be the environment. I talked last week about a priming example where a person was holding a cup of warm liquid versus a cup of cold liquid. And they found that when they were holding the warm liquid, their response was much more compassionate. And this was a controlled environment, double-blind studies. And this is also peer-reviewed, which means other scientists were able to achieve the same thing. Now, it makes sense because we know that 95% is by habit. We know that habit is basically the neurons firing and wiring, and that's physiological. So it makes sense that if we're holding a warm liquid, there's more warmth. It's the priming of warmth, and that's hence the more compassionate response. That's my words. It's not John Barger's, who did the experiment. But you can see, using that example, how easily words and the environment can trigger people, or at least prime people, and then priming can lead to triggering. The next thing we have is that leads to beliefs and stories. So here I was talking about beliefs in our conditioning. Here I'm talking about beliefs in the stories, and you can see they go together. And then I have condition again, and this is what we're talking about today. So here we want to be talking about a growth mindset. The way our conditioning is set drives our mindset, because the mindset is conscious, and conscious is we're only living consciously 5% of the time. So if you have a growth mindset, but you're only living consciously 5% of the time, and that growth mindset is all on mental cognitive processing, you can see you really probably have a fixed mindset, or at least you could have a fixed mindset. That's where we are today. Now, let's take an example to drive this home a little bit. So let's say that diagram, and at the end, we have the SR cycle. That's stimulus response. Before that, so we have mindset, and that would be a growth mindset, of course, that we want. And then here we have this whole section. And in this section, we go from conditioning, we have our beliefs, we have our condition, we have our priming, we have our beliefs, we have our stories, and then we have the condition again. While I'm talking about stimulus response, which is usually thought of as a two-step cycle, and by the way, stimulus response, when you look at the timing of the subconscious and the conscious, you'll see that you're only talking about a second or two. That whole stimulus response that can change a person's life for good or bad. That stimulus response can start fights. And it's literally only 2 seconds that we can get control of. The challenge is to get control of it here after all this is done. And if you're in the wrong mindset, it's very, very difficult. What we want to do is go upstream. I drew this picture as I'll call this level 1. This is where we do based on what we know. I've often said to know and not do is to not know. So everybody knows stuff. We all know, right? I mean, they tell us that we forget 85% of what we've heard and read, but still, even that 15% that we retain, to me, to know and not do is not better than not knowing, usually. So I look at what a person does. I don't look at what they do. This is why behavioral descriptive interviewing is so powerful, because it's going in the past to see the behaviors. But I'm going to tell you the limitation of behavioral descriptive interviewing. I'm going to make a note here so I come back to it. Behavioral descriptive interviewing, it has limitations as good as it is. And as a business owner or as a leader of a team, you want to understand this. Now, let's say we have level 2. It looks the same, but it can be very different. So level 1 is familiar. That's level 1. Level 2 is stressed. In level 2, so what happens when we get into stress? Cortisol starts running through our body and it puts it in, it preps us for fight or flight. We may not be in fight or flight, but we're prepped for fight or flight. And that prepping, when the cortisol is running through our body, we start monitoring for other threats or for the perceived threat. We start monitoring to see if that threat is getting closer. Is it materializing? And imagine how absurd that is when you consider you might get some information that something might happen one day, possibly in the future, and we start stressing about it now, monitoring it every day. We wake up, did we get news? The date's not even set for a year and a half, but we're looking at it every day. That's that cortisol. And we want to stop the cortisol from happening, but you can't suppress it. Once it's coming up, it's basically survival. It's saying, hey, we need to monitor this because it's potentially an existential threat. The problem is the subconscious makes everything an existential threat. Everything is a Serengeti tiger. It makes it very difficult to suppress it because as you suppress it, because it's thinking it's keeping you alive, it just gets more energy from yourself to put more emphasis on it. This is how you get all tensed up and now you got adrenaline flowing because you're not paying attention. One of the things is simple. You can acknowledge it, you can understand it, lean into it, learn from it. And then literally, I will say this in meetings sometimes, let's just put that in a box and put it aside because sometimes all you have to do is acknowledge, yes, we see the threat. We know the threat is there. We're going to give it attention. And by the way, we're going to make a note about it. We're going to have a meeting on it next week. Everybody can calm down. Now, if you wait too long, that doesn't work because now you've got the adrenaline, person's already in fight or flight, so they're going to fight everything you say or run away or freeze or faint. In the beginning, when you're seeing that rise, and you could do it with yourself, you could do it, you know what, I'm going to deal with this, but I'm going to take care of it tomorrow morning. I'm going to spend an hour, I'm going to block out an hour to deal with this. I need to look into it. And now you're back on track, but you have to catch it early. So this is level 2 stressed. And the point I was making is once you're stressed, you're going to behave differently. So now you may have had a growth mindset in level 1, but in level 2, you have a fixed mindset. But because your belief is that you have a growth mindset, you don't notice that you've slipped into a fixed. You still perceive yourself because your identity is that you have a growth mindset. But to everybody around you, it's like totally fixed. And then you'll fight that because now that puts you into potentially fight or flight. So that's the fixed mindset. Will change your stimulus response. Just because you know something doesn't mean your stimulus response is going to behave in the way that you're expecting. And certainly when you're stressed, and you see me do this quite often, and for those on just audio, I'm closing my hands around my eyes like you're tightening up the field of view. Because that's what happens when you're getting into fight or flight is you're starting to zero in on that proverbial Serengeti tiger, you narrow your vision. This is why people under high stress, they won't see other things that are going on. Interview witnesses at a crime scene. It's like so many people have different versions of it because people were stressing out and they were narrowed in. If you go into a party and everybody focuses on 10 degrees of the room, but everybody's focused on a different 10 degrees of the room, you see how everybody can walk out of there with a completely different experience. And that's what happens when we get into stress. We're seeing the wrong stuff. So we have to have skills to keep pushing our vision out. When you look at Navy SEALs or Army Rangers, race car drivers, these people are trained. Basically, I like to think of it as the stimulus response cycle that we were born with or that we were conditioned with from 0 to 7. We've broken it and reset it. And that's what this work is about, is resetting your condition, your stimulus response cycle. But I do it with you, not to you. You have to be the one who drives it. This is why I want people working on purpose, something that's bigger than them, because we're literally walking into a land that they've never been in before, and it's scary. Having a different response is also uncomfortable. And then the second thing that happens is we get up into the land of possibility, because now we're out of our old paradigm, we're out of our old constraints, and now we're operating in possibility. But in possibility, you talk about VUCA, there's all kinds of uncertainty in the field of possibility. When I've been in my little happy zone, and you can see this, I have some episodes out there above the line. If you're just in this little happy zone, it may not be happy, you may not be comfortable there, you may not like it there, but it's familiar. And you move up above that zone into the possibilities, and it's like all bets are off, everything. So that's where we talk about getting consistent and principle based, because then whatever happens, you're always on a platform to launch into the next thing. Another story. Then we have level 3, and you can probably surmise where this is. So now we have the same thing, stimulus response. We have the mindset, and then we have this whole pre-stimulus area. And the pre-stimulus area is our beliefs, our condition, our priming, our stories. And you can see that this is definitely fixed. This is a super fixed mindset. In fact, this is where a person could be arguing for their weaknesses, right? If a person is arguing for their weaknesses, then all it's going to do is keep priming and triggering and priming and triggering and priming and triggering. And this level 3 would be triggered. Now, once triggered, I would say the adrenaline is flowing. They're in fight or flight, freeze or faint mode, and they're shutting down. They're closed in. They don't see. And the more, if you think about a person in a phobia and someone's talking to them about, hey, it's not bad. It's just a snake. It's a toy snake. If they're already triggered into that fight or flight response, the person who's talking to them about the snake might as well be a snake, because now they're coming after them. It's the same way a person who's drowning, they'll take out the person who's trying to save them, not because they don't want to be saved. It's just that they're just fighting everything. Everything around them is a threat. They're so heightened. So triggered, we want to avoid getting triggered, but once you're triggered, it's very difficult with the normal conditioning response. There are ways to deal with that, which we'll talk about. The better thing is to avoid triggering. And you have, on a relative basis, if stimulus response is only 1 or 2 seconds, you have another 2 or 3 minutes, or a total of 2 or 3 minutes, to reverse this stressed level. When you get into this stressed, and we're going to talk about that it'll be the 8th episode. But once you're here in this level 3 triggered, the problem is that emotion that comes up in level 2 when you're stressed, it now becomes a feeling. It becomes a chemical event in your body. I mentioned cortisol, and now it's in you. And people who've been involved in a stimulus response, you may be speeding and the police comes up behind you and the lights light up. You may get that adrenaline. You may have that for 2 or 3 hours in your body. It's just streaming through your body, even though the event is past and resolved. So it's a chemical event at that point. What's interesting about this is this box here. I'm just going to put beliefs, condition, priming, and condition 2. We'll call this condition 1. We'll call this condition 2. And that's that box. 2 weeks ago, I said, if you have a belief, you believe that you have potential, greater potential, that something is available to you. This is having a growth mindset. And you take action based on that. Now you'll get a different result than you've gotten before. It may not be the result you want, but it'll be a different result and you can learn. And because you have a growth mindset, you don't look at feedback as failure. You look at feedback as feedback. It's learning. It's one more way that doesn't work, but you've pulled something from it. That goes into your judgment and your experience and those kinds of things. What happens with this cycle is this will continue to be a loop, and people don't realize that they're in a loop. This is why when I mentioned that behavioral descriptive interviewing, and for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, when you're conducting a job interview, you're asking the people to come up with a difficult situation that they had to handle in their past, and you want to know what the outcome was and have them walk you through it. And it's a way to get beyond I'm great, I'm the greatest in the world, because now you're actually seeing, 1, what is difficult to them, what do they consider difficult, and 2, their thought process and their action going through it. And then 3, also whether or not it worked, but more importantly, how they approached it. You can actually hear the growth of fixed mindset coming out when they go through that. It's interesting. I've done behavioral interviewing, and I remember interviewing people, and it's funny how some people, their difficult thing was monumental, huge. And other people, their difficult thing was they were trying to get into a course and it was blocked and they couldn't get into it, and they did this and then they got into the course. Nothing against that. But when you're thinking about hiring a person who's going to have freedom of action and has to be able to rely on judgment, just that answer gives you a sense of where they are. I wanted to make the point about the BDI because it does have to do with the Peter Principle. Peter Principle suggests that people will get promoted to one level above where they can handle. I would argue that BDI works because it's based on conditioning. You're asking about their role in the past. People's conditioning is what plays out at work. So let's say it another way, people's conditioning leads to their results, right? If you're doing 95% of everything you do is done by habit, then that suggests that your results are coming from a conditioned set of responses. And that conditioned set of responses was largely formed from age 0 to 7, fine-tuned during the teen years, and turned into a model of the world during the prefrontal cortex formation in the 20s. When you hire somebody based on BDI, that was great in the manufacturing days and the days when things moved a little bit slower. But in the 60s and 70s, Gordon's law, technology capability will double every 18 months. If you look at that on a compound curve, we're in the steep part of it. We're in that vertical end of it. And things are changing fast. Look at what AI, look at what the internet has done. Look at what AI has done in just short periods of time. Cloud computing. You said internet, then cloud computing, and then artificial intelligence, social media, put that in there. And so it's only going to get more, right? More VUCA, more VUCA, more VUCA. So if I was doing BDI today, I wouldn't be so much looking for what's the difficult thing they handled. I want to see how they dealt with change, how they looked into the unknown, how they dealt with things where there was no definition. One of the challenges I had when I was mentoring people in the corporate world was I noticed a lot of my A students had trouble coming up with a point of view, because in school, what got them an A was to reflect the point of view of the professor. And now I'm asking them to formulate their own point of view. It's not that they couldn't do it. It's that they were spending too much energy and time trying to figure out what the right answer was. And it was clouding their thinking, and they couldn't come up with a point of view because they didn't trust their own point of views. If you take that and you look at it in the context of BDI, I'm more interested in how people can deal with the unknown and living in the world of possibility, and how they can put things, unrelated things, and pull them together to create. It's a little bit more difficult of a question, but you can see where people live, and very quickly you'll see, does this person live in like 98% conditioning, or is this person stepping out and operating at the low 90s level? And I don't want to be operating in the low 80s. I'm fine with 90%. I just want my 90% conditioning to be based on my goals, my vision, my self-actualization, right? Based on my priorities. The same way a person training a dog will get the dog to look at them or do things to make sure the dog is looking at them because they want the dog to follow their commands. That's what I want my habitual habit patterns doing. I want them to first look at me to make sure, when I say me, my self-actualization is my goal, my vision, whatever, to make sure that that's what I want. I talked about the levels. We got level 1 is familiar, level 2, stressed, level 3 is triggered. What we want to do with this idea is to shift. So let's say that right now in these 3 levels, because the subconscious has a bias for negativity, news is negative. I don't think anybody would argue with me if I said that anxiety is getting more and more pervasive. So let's say that in our life, we operate here, level 1. And then I would say, let's say that level 2 and 3 are evenly split. What we want to do is make the shift from this kind of living to this kind of living. And what I'm doing here is making a shift because we're raising our level each time. When we start living like this, most of our stimulus response is in a level 1, which is where it should be, right? I mean, if you think about level 3 being Serengeti tigers in your face, how many of those do we really have in a lifetime? I would say maybe 2. Now, if you take in automobile accidents and, on vacation and crazy things happening, okay, maybe 4, maybe 5 existential moments in an entire lifetime. Most people can't remember the second worst thing that happened to them 5 years ago. They can remember the first often, the worst thing, but not the second worst, because it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad enough to be memorable. So looking forward, why would we continue to get hyper over these things that are occurring? So it's not just about not letting ourselves get into a 2 and 3. It's about when you're in a 2, moving back to a 1 very quickly. And that's what we'll be talking about in episode 69 and 70. And once you're there, it's a game changer because you no longer are living on edge that there's going to be something that occurs that you can't handle, because you already know how to handle everything. Because the reason you know how to handle everything is because you're living by principles. And so no matter what happens, you're on a good foundation. It's sort of like a person in martial arts who knows how to fight. They don't mind walking into crazy situations because they know how to fight. They don't know who they're going to end up fighting, but they know how to fight. And it's the same thing with Rangers and SEALs. They've trained so much, and it's always the unknown. They're always being thrown curveballs in training, so they know that they have this ability to step up. And the other thing that they learn, and this is the habit, This is probably the biggest thing, is that what we want to do is make it a habit. We want to make staying mindful and using our full capabilities and make that a habit. Last week we talked about priming, and I talked about the power of words. It's a great session, because we talk about transformation of vocabulary. And then we have this condition which exists before the stimulus response cycle. And by the way, it's not just stimulus response, it's stimulus reaction response. And what we want to do is no longer have the response equal the reaction. The reaction is often a survival reaction. If you make your response equal the survival reaction, you're causing more problems than you're solving in most cases. So what we want to do is put a little pause, and I'm not talking about a big pause, it's a half-second pause between reaction and response. Here, we're going to have neuroplasticity, and we're going to have deep practice. Now, most people have heard neuroplasticity. For people in my age group, it wasn't even a thing. I don't think this term was even used, at least not for lay people, until in the early 2000s. Neuroplasticity is the rewiring of the neural pathway. So I mentioned we have 200 billion neurons. The neurons fire and wire with other neurons, up to 10,000 other neurons, maybe more. So there's a lot of activity going on there. When a neural pathway is used often, this is where muscle memory comes into play, but I call it nervous system memory because that's more accurate. Nervous system memory comes when you engage in something often enough and it gets wrapped with myelin. But there's different ways for myelin to get to wrap neurons. It can come from repetition, which is what we normally think about. If you're in school, you're doing a lot of repetition and you're building that neural pathway. It can come from duration. If you're living in a state for a long time, that neural pathway will keep firing and firing and firing. Myelin's going to wrap. Or the intensity. This is like a phobia. It's so intense that this thing wrapped that neural pathway so strong, existential level, that 30 years later a person hears the word snake and they freak out. There's different ways, and what we do with neuroplasticity is bring that into our own power. This is what I mean when I say we want to make the automaticity working for us, because we're literally changing the stimulus response or stimulus reaction response cycle to be based on what we need and what we want. I said earlier, breaking the old stimulus response is what I look at it as doing, because the old stimulus response was set up based on your world at 0 to 5, 0 to 7. Probably not the same world you're living in right now. So neuroplasticity, most people tried to break habits. And by the way, when I talk about life expansion after 50, if I'm talking to somebody who's 60 years old, it's like they're not even interested. It's like, come on, man, I've been there, tried all that stuff. It's not available to me. They've lived it so long that neural pathway is locked in. But even for that person, it can change. And it starts with this process of going upstream. And what I described as when we go through this cycle, right, from the belief to condition to priming to condition, we want to keep leveling up. You just keep leveling up. The reason why you have to level up is because your mindset, now remember before we had beliefs, right? The reason why we have to keep leveling up is because you got to have a growth mindset to start working on your beliefs. But you have to, in order to work on your beliefs, you kind of have to believe that you can. And so we get into this chicken or the egg, and sometimes the first few laps around is really just baby steps just to get the person to accept that, okay, there is more possible. We start challenging the references of the beliefs like we talked about 2 weeks ago. We start changing their version of the world with respect to priming, and now you can take a step up. But then when they get into this step up, guess what? New stimuli show up. They have more threats, and then we have to do it again, and we do it again. But the more you do it, the easier it gets. And then it becomes a habit. Actually, doing this thing here will become a habit, but you have to stay with it, because if you don't stay with it, guess where you go? You go back, because this is the familiar, and we don't want to go back. And then you have to start over again. But each time you start over, it gets easier. This is when you've seen leaders, those of you who lead others, when you've seen leaders work through the Peter principle, this is what's happening. They're going back, but they keep trying to have a growth mindset. They keep working on it, and eventually they evolve to something greater. This doesn't have to be a slow process. When I say slow, it doesn't have to be years. It could be done in 3 to 6 months if the person is willing to do the work and they're willing to act on the awareness. See, when a person is doing the things that bring them back here, they're aware of it. They're just not choosing to do something about it. And what we have to do is get them to act on the awareness. Why are they not doing something? Because if they're looking to their habits are telling them what to do next, and the thing to do next brings them back here. This is the challenge. So what we have is neuroplasticity, and we have deep practice. There's a couple of great books. Angela Duckworth, she wrote a book, Grit, and it's about deep practice, and she talks about myelin. Dan Coyle wrote a book called The Talent Code. He wrote about neuroplasticity. He wrote more about myelin, but it's part of neuroplasticity, and talks about deep practice. If you look at those two books, you have the nice view of myelin and understanding myelin. And once you see this, you can't see the subconscious as a mind anymore. It's just a physiological cognitive processing mechanism that the mind looks to wrongly. And what we want to do is have the higher self, which is our awareness, and then the conscious mind, and then the subconscious. And the subconscious, in my view, is not a mind, and it should be below the mind, hence the word sub. So neuroplasticity, the reason why habits can change is because the myelin that wraps around the neuron, that makes the neuron very resistant to change. It makes it fire faster, more accurately, with more precision and on cue. And so that's hard to change. I use the example of, it's like a steel beam, steel I-beam, and somebody's trying to cut it with the nail file. It just doesn't work. This is why we end up living by habits, because we believe we can't change them. But if you look at the end of the steel beam, you have some bolts, and you can take those bolts off and then just move the steel beam. Those bolts, in this analogy, would be the synapse, the neurotransmitter. And dopamine and serotonin are neurotransmitters. So as you start to understand how those interplay, then you can see how we can create habits. But the neurotransmitter, when we're layering on a new habit, and James Clear in his book Atomic Habits talks about this, but he doesn't describe it this way, but he talks about layering on a new habit or connecting the desired habit to something that you already do. As you layer on the new habit, the neurotransmitter that was connecting the neurons from the old habit moved to the new one. So in other words, we're wired to learn. We're wired to do what we were doing when we were 0 to 7 and even 7 to 19. It's just that after the prefrontal cortex, we became so judgmental that we look at everything as a pass-fail, and we look at a 95 as a failure. It doesn't help that that's the way we're communicated too often by leaders and organizations. You mess up one time, it's But if you look at it from a learning standpoint, the kid on the bicycle with the training wheels, hey, 65%, you're still in the game. Now, don't stay at 65%. We need to get you to 75, 85, 95, 100, and let's talk about a plan to get there. But having a 65 coming out the gate, so what? There are people who made 100 that came out the gate with 45. There are people who had to take the class a second time. So don't fall into that trap. And one of the ways to not fall into that trap is don't put a time limit when you're talking about expansion, self-actualization, purpose, things that are above the line. So that's, let me just do a quick recap, because I'm not going to get into neuroplasticity today. That's a big topic, and it works better when we use the actual context that the person is going through. The way I would look at it is, I did this belief, condition, reaction, and I talked about it a little earlier today, and we're making a shift from belief, action to result, which changes the belief. But then what we want to do is have belief, potential, action, result, and that changes the belief. But now what I want to do is think of it like this. Instead of belief, I'm going to put condition, state of mind, state of body, who we are, where we are at the present time, positive energy, negative energy. We take our condition and we have to believe that there's more available to us. So that's the potential. And then we engage in deep practice, which changes our neuroplasticity, which changes our condition. And that's that cycle that I was talking about. That's the thing that enables us to do this. But because the entire thing in our lives is this is pre-stimulus, and this is stimulus reaction response, but this whole thing impacts our behavior, and when you roll up our behaviors, it turns into our personality. So this whole thing leads to our outcomes. So in a couple of the next few weeks, we'll be talking about this area over here, but then we have to apply it to this. Because this is seconds and minutes. This is days, weeks, months, and years. And sometimes we have to go way upstream to find the triggering event that keeps pushing the person from level 1 down to level 3. And we've got to get to the point where we are operating like this. Just a little bit of activity takes us to level 3. Slightly more is in the level 2, but we can actually manage or modulate that and get back to level 1. So we have 1, 2, and 3. That's the idea. And we're going to use the principles we talk about in stimulus reaction response and apply those to the larger pre-stimulus. And you can go back to the episode, I think it's 64, where I talked about beliefs. So I actually walked through an exercise in there to go back into your past in a way that's non-threatening. It's easy to do, easy to follow. It works. And it's not so much about changing the beliefs, but to become aware of where you got the belief from. Sometimes just the awareness that the belief is not based on credible references is enough for it to drop. Maybe not in the beginning because you have a lot of conditioning wrapped around it, but later on you'll find that this process, just the awareness that a habit no longer serves you, is often enough to break the habit. Quickly, I'm talking about real time, just awareness, and bam. And you know people who do that. It's just they move on. And that's we can learn that because it's physiological cognitive processing. It's not mental cognitive processing. I'm going to leave it there. I'll leave the prior episodes up for a few weeks. Most of this is moving back behind the paywall. They do this without ads. And into 2025, what I'm doing is setting up a community, a mastermind community of people who are moving for life expansion, whether it's doing more of the work that they've been doing, maybe a phase 2, completely different career, or maybe just really wanting to enjoy and live their life. Even if you're not working on something that's purpose or hard, if you want to travel and live your life, it still requires a plan. It still requires new thinking. So whatever you want to do, life expansion is up to you. You want to do basket weaving? Life expansion is for you. You want to have a phase 2? Life expansion is for you. You want to chase your dreams and that purpose you had? Life expansion is there. We're going to set up a community around it. If you go out to the 7 Fitness Areas platform, if you enroll in the Life Expansion After 50 podcast with an annual subscription, you'll receive automatic enrollment into my new mastermind community launching in the first quarter of 2025. This isn't just any mastermind. It's tailored for leaders and business owners who have already experienced success but are hungry for and pursuing that next level, whatever that means for them. In fact, it's ideal for anyone who's hit a plateau or maybe navigating an uncharted territory or stepping into their self-actualization and their next phase. But anyone who enrolls between now and the end of the year will be enrolled in that automatically. All right, so that is it. Next week, we'll start talking about the stimulus reaction response cycle. We'll see you then.